Hello and welcome to this Unit 1 overview for Geography 102. In this overview we're going to look at some key themes and topics for the Unit 1 readings. We'll start out with Finlayson's intro and the sense of place reading. In Finlayson's intro, she talks about the key questions in geography, why and where. Now anybody could answer the question where is something by looking at a map or going online, but the important investigation with geography is why is something occurring where it is. So keep those two questions in mind. Geography is the spatial approach to understanding the world. And in order to investigate, we need those two questions. Why and where is a certain phenomenon occurring? So after her look at the basics of geography, she moves into the idea of globalization. Globalization is the increased interconnectedness of people, places, and institutions around the world. I want you to think about this for a moment. The definition is a series of words, right? But think about how globalization affects you. And that's going to be a running theme throughout this semester. How are you part of a global world? Globalization, again, is the increased interconnection among people, places, and institutions around the world. Think about where the clothes you're wearing are from. Think about where the food you have eaten today has come from. Think about where the media is coming from. And you begin to better understand that your day-to-day life is guided, influenced by, and also influences people and places and institutions around the world. Globalization is such an incredibly important part of who we are. Finlayson is then going to look at a framework known as core periphery. As we look around the world and we better understand what's happening in different countries, different nations, in different parts of the world, we start to see through this global network a core and periphery establishment. The core is the place that dictates interaction, that dictates growth, that it dictates development, and is also the biggest recipient, the biggest benefactor of globalization. When we look at core periphery, we often look at places like the United States as the core, and then different countries that supply our consumer goods, places that supply us coffee or clothes or toys or electronics. We see that many of these countries are actually part of the periphery. The periphery is then really at the mercy of the core. So if the core demands something else, if the core changes its mode of production, if the periphery charges too much money, the core could start to look elsewhere for different relationships. So again, we'll get into this core periphery setup as we better understand globalization and we better understand relationships among populations and countries around the world. An important concept that Finlayson introduces in this first chapter is the demographic transition model. And what we're going to understand is that different countries are experiencing different types of demographic change. Here in the United States, our population would actually begin to shrink. It would actually age, meaning it would get older, the average age would get older, and our population would begin to contract if not for immigration. We have reached a point in our demographic transition where we're not at replacement level with fertility, meaning that for every 2 adults, we're not replacing those 2 adults through natural childbirth. So the United States would be in a situation that is currently being experienced in places like Portugal and Japan, where the total population is contracting. But again, because of immigration, the United States is a bit different. And then we'll look around the world at other places. We'll look at places like Mali in Africa and see how a young population with a high fertility rate is growing rapidly. And what are some of the pros and cons of rapid population growth, or what are some of the pros and cons of a population that is in the current state that we are in here in the United States? And then the supplementary reading is on place attachment. It's important as we go through this semester that we're not just looking objectively at stats and key figures and places and names, but we're also understanding that the human experience is about place as well, the meaning of location to individuals. When we look at world regional geography, we're looking at over 7.5 billion people here on Earth's surface, and we need to understand that their sense of place, their attachment to these different locations is different. We don't share a similar view of locations. We don't share a similar view of place with 7.5 billion people. So it's important to understand that as we dig into these different parts of the world, these different regions, these different cultures, that we are mindful that place varies across locations. Religion, culture, food, family, language, these all carry different meanings in different parts of the world, and that your place attachment may be shared with your immediate family and community, but maybe it varies drastically with people thousands of miles away, or even people in your neighborhood. The next readings we'll look at are by a different author, Greiner, and she introduces culture and globalization. And Greiner introduces a really important concept that we're gonna look at throughout the semester, and that's your cultural landscape. The cultural landscape is the way that we modify the area around us to fit our needs and wants. If you look out your window right now, or you take a walk or a ride or a drive down the street, you'll begin to see how we have influenced the natural environment to reflect who we are. Think about the way we build houses. Think about the businesses that are located in your community. They reflect who we are. A church, a mosque, a synagogue reflect who we are. The types of food we eat, the types of clothing we buy, the types of retail stores that are in our community reflect who we are. So the cultural landscape is the way that we modify the area around us, the landscape around us, to reflect us. Now, if you are in Maryland, if you are in New Jersey, if you're in Massachusetts, the cultural landscapes might vary a little bit. But when we explore South Asia, when we explore Russia, when we explore Latin America, we're going to see how these cultural landscapes are really much different than what we would find in our own backyards. Within globalization and the cultural landscape, we encounter what are called consequences, and sometimes these consequences are glocalization, which is the merging of global and local culture to create something new. Homogenization. So as globalization takes hold, we might go to other cities in the world and we might see McDonald's, Pizza Hut, some of the same businesses that we find in our backyard. So oftentimes this globalization process creates a sameness known as homogenization. We also find polarization. This oftentimes is the rejection of global processes. In certain parts of the world, Western culture and attitudes are rejected. So you're going to not only not find them, but you're also going to find a sentiment that is quite the opposite. And in this set of readings, we're going to look at pop versus folk culture. Pop just means popular culture. What are the shared culture traits? How do we interact with each other? How do we perform our tasks? How do we pursue goods that we consume? Popular culture is shared. Folk culture, on the other hand, exists in relatively small homogeneous communities. We'll look at some examples like the Amish, the Arabers in Baltimore City, the Gula in southeastern United States, and see how these groups fall out of popular culture. In the third set of readings, we'll look at Finlayson's depiction of Europe and also migration. Europe, as we're going to see, is really complex. The history, but from the Greeks to the Romans to the medieval times to the age of exploration and empire building. Europe's history is wrought with conflict and identity and changing sense of place. Europe that we know today is often highlighted by the European Union, which is a centripetal force, something that brings these countries together. We have the establishment of the EU, the European Union, is centuries in the making. But we also see these cracks, the centrifugal forces, which mean to flee the center, to break apart, to balkanize, which is a European term. This fragmentation, or the threat of fragmentation, or the underlying currents of fragmentation, has been part of Europe's history. We're seeing it now with Brexit, where the United Kingdom has left the European Union, and when we experience times of cultural or economic distress, we see these centrifugal forces create at least a push for more fragmentation. So Europe's history is very complex. We see how cultures that were established thousands of years ago like the Romans, continue to influence Europe today. But at the same time, Europe has gone through a roller coaster of centrifugal, which means to break apart, and centripetal, which means to unify forces. The second key concept in these readings is migration, and Finlayson talks about migration, and then there's also another look by Greiner at migration. And when we talk about migration, it's really important to objectively understand push and pull factors. Why are people leaving a place? Why are people arriving somewhere else? It's easy to say that people are going somewhere. Places like the United States, we're seeing that we have people that are undocumented or unauthorized entering the United States. That's one side of the story. Whether it's in the United States, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in Africa, Latin America, understanding push and pull factors. What is pulling someone towards a place? What is pushing them from their area of origin? This is key to understanding migration. We also look at cumulative causation, how areas that have strong pull factors often benefit at the expense of other areas. So some areas might lose their best and brightest through a brain drain to areas that are prospering. We see this internationally. We also see it within countries where certain places like New York City might benefit at the attraction of talent at the expense of places that you might find in Appalachia. Places like the United States benefit from attracting talent from around the world to work in medicine. And that could come at the expense of doctors leaving Italy, doctors leaving Uruguay, doctors leaving India, right? So we see this cumulative causation where growth begets growth, and it has a bigger effect on international migration. And an important concept, and one that you'll look at in your first field report, is transnational landscapes. This is how our cultural landscape, introduced earlier, is affected by the movement of people around the world. It's important to recognize that when people move, culture moves with them. And as cultures come together, we create something new. A transnational landscape is a landscape that reflects the coming together of two or more cultures. We see this prominently in places like Chinatown. We see this historically in places like Little Italy. We see this evolving in places that are now enclaves for Hispanic in Middle Eastern communities. So these transnational landscapes they reflect the evolution of our cultural landscape as more and more cultures come together. And we wrap up Unit 1 by looking at Russia, the massive country located across Eastern Europe and Asia. And we'll look at the demographic issues that coincide with economic collapse. And we'll look at the history and culture and how ethnicity and Russification create conflict, and how Russia tries to govern this massive, diverse, complex space. And the push for Russian language and culture and heritage is oftentimes at odds with many of the people that are oppressed or governed by the Russian Federation. And we wrap up with language. And language, we're going to look at your general language families and the historical diffusion. So why do we speak this language in this part of the world? But what I think you're going to find interesting is the modern diffusion and evolution of languages. We're going to look at trade languages, which are known as lingua franca, and see how English, where we have fewer than 400 million English speakers, English is a first language in the world, but about 1.5 billion people are learning English today for financial reasons, to support tourism, to engage in international communication. We'll also see how languages evolve through a look at pidgins. Pidgins are contact languages. As two groups come together with no established way of interacting, a new language evolves. And if that language, that new pidgin, that oftentimes is just used for trade or simple interactions, if that pidgin evolves and becomes formalized and taught to kids as a first language, it becomes what's known as a Creole, a term you're probably familiar with, but we'll likely learn a little bit more about when we get into these readings. So this is just an overview. The readings and the lecture slides will carry more content and more information. If you have questions, please let me know. We could discuss via email, or if it's more in depth, preferably we can meet via Zoom. So good luck as you get underway, and I'll talk to you soon.